Good evening, everyone. Oh, is that okay? Is that very loud? It's all right? All right. I would like to begin by thanking the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture, as well as the Committee on Medieval Studies for inviting me to speak today. It is quite an honor to enjoy joint sponsorship. And of course, thank you, David and Sean, for the kind introductions. So when I teach my introductory survey of Islamic art and architecture, I regularly include a special segment called Squinting at Leaves. It's a silly name meant to make students laugh, but it's also a fairly accurate shorthand for the intense scrutiny of non-figure ornament that characterizes my approach to Islamic art and architecture. As you all know, the debate on how, or even if, we might interpret this kind of ornament still rages. Tactics range from total dismissals of symbolic or semiotic potential to impassioned defenses of the idea that non-figure ornament can, in fact, mean something. The most successful scholarship in the latter vein rests on close looking at the ornament in question, accompanied by a deep understanding of its historical context, often gained through close reading of historical, literary, or theological texts. Scholars like Cynthia Robinson, Yasser Tabar, and Gulru Nijipoglu have modeled this method. Although their work is varied in scope and subject, it shares a basic feature, exploring the ways in which intellectual, religious, or theological currents can shed interpretive light on the formal qualities of non-figure ornament. All of them have impacted the way that I approach the ornamental programs of Almohad Friday mosques. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I will suggest that both the amount and the formal qualities of Almohad vegetal ornament correspond to their doctrinal positions as they are expressed in key theological texts. Specifically, I will draw a distinction between the first and second generation Almohad theology and art. The movement's early leaders sought to formulate and express an ontological position regarding God. In essence, they were concerned with defining what God is and what he isn't, and the results of this process manifests both in words and on walls. A generation later, the Almohad political and intellectual elite were more interested in epistemological questions. They wanted to describe precisely how one can arrive at certain knowledge about God, beginning with the most basic notion that he exists. These epistemological concerns also crystallize in contemporary texts and in architectural ornament. Finally, I will explore the complex relationship between text and building, characterizing them as mutually dependent products of human effort as opposed to ossified artifacts that influence one another. When considered in this way, we gain a richer and more complete understanding of the time in which they were created. But first, a bit of history. The Almohad movement began in the first quarter of the 12th century when Ibn Tumart, a fiery preacher cum theologian and religious reformer, advocated for the return of fundamentals of Islamic belief and practice. I will come back to his doctrine in a few moments, but very briefly, it is predicated upon the affirmation of divine unity. The Almohad's very name, Al-Muwahhidun in Arabic, can be translated as those who profess God's unity. Ibn Tumart's successor, the Caliph Abu Mu'min, swept through North Africa with an army of Almohads, ousting the previous rulers, the Almoravids, from their capital of Marrakesh in 1147. In the wake of his triumph, he established the Mu'minid dynasty, which would become the Almohad Empire. He also ushered in the Almohad architectural style, building congregational mosques in the Moroccan cities of Taza, Tinmal, and Marrakesh. You see Tinmal on the left and Marrakesh's Qutubiyya minaret on the right. Abdul Mu'min's son, Abu Yaqub Yusuf, continued his father's penchant for building, founding the Great Mosque of Seville in 1172. Abu Yaqub also fostered a lively intellectual climate. In fact, two of the Caliph's courtiers, the Aristotelian philosophers Ibn Tufail and Ibn Rushd, will be significant for my reading of the Mosque of Seville. So let's begin with a comparison. On the left, you have the mihrab facade of the Almoravid Mosque at Tlemcen, a building that constitutes precious evidence of an architectural style that was almost obliterated by their Almohad conquerors. For those of you perhaps familiar with Islamic architectural vocabulary, a mihrab is a niche, sometimes a small room, like you see here, usually located in the center of the Qibla wall, which faces Mecca. Two things are noteworthy here, beginning with composition. Starting on the back wall, a horseshoe arch encased in a quadrangular frame or an alfice leads to a small chamber, which is the mihrab itself. Above this grouping, ornamental bands and a small lined arcade run in several registers. If we could tilt the camera up further, we would see Tlemcen's unique perforated stucco dome crowning the bay. You can see just a hint of it up here. The entire composition is framed by a transverse polylobe arch that precedes the mihrab bay. The second noteworthy feature here is ornamental. I'll simply draw your attention to the amount and kind of ornament used at Tlemcen. Almost every surface is covered, and much of it, such as these line scrolls here, and although it's a little bit more difficult to see, the ornament in these corners is vegetal in nature. Then we have the facade of the Almohad Kutubiyya Mosque, which replaced the now lost Almohad Friday Mosque in Marrakesh, is on the right. We have a familiar composition in Kutubiyya, the framing arch here, of course, mihrab room, small horseshoe arch, square alfice, and registers of ornaments, including a blind arcade. Finally, although we cannot see it in this photograph, a Muqaddas dome tops the entire bay. Aside from certain typological shifts, for example, the transverse arch is polylobed on the left and lambrequin on the right, the most marked difference between these two buildings is ornamental. First, the amount of surface ornament has been scaled back in the Almohad Mosque. In some places, it's been completely omitted, such as the spaces between the transverse arch and its alfice. In others, such as in the mihrab facade, it's been reduced considerably, leaving a bare-bones scheme that articulates the building's line and the entire composition. For example, you might notice that the blind lambrequin arch in the Tlemcen Mosque, you can just see its silhouette right here, has been freed from the wall in the Kutubiyya Mosque. Its ornate silhouette on the right draws attention to the very arch it describes. The Kutubiyya's ornament also differs in kind. Rather than primarily vegetal forms like in the Tlemcen Mosque, at the Kutubiyya we find geometric shapes and star friezes. The alfice is filled with one right here. Vegetal motifs occur only sparingly, such as these panels up on the mihrab facade and others around the bases of the Kutubiyya's 5 domes. This pared-down linear aesthetic characterizes the two earliest, best-preserved Almohad mosques, both built by Abdul Mu'min. We have the Kutubiyya again on the right, and the Mosque of Tinmul appears on the left, which is located in the eponymous village southwest of Marrakesh. Speaking generally, I agree with the many scholars, beginning in the late 1940s with the Spanish art historian Leopoldo Flores Balbas, who argue that Almohad ornamental restraint is a product of the reforming ideology. I would point to the Almohad's father, I do this every time I practice, every time I say father. I would point to the Almohad's founder, Ibn Tumart, specifically. In every 12th century account known to me, even those written outside the Almohad domain, Ibn Tumart is lauded for his great piety and asceticism. In these texts, Ibn Tumart embodies a familiar trope of personal sanctity. He dresses simply, speaks plain truth, often to power, and rides a humble donkey. A key part of Ibn Tumart's reforming mission was the performance of the hisbah, or the censuring of reprehensible customs and the enjoining of good ones. The former included criticizing the Almoravids for bringing impure materials into mosques in the form of rugs dyed with pigeon dung, and the latter involved founding several new mosques. Unfortunately, Ibn Tumart's mosques do not survive, and the sources do not describe them in any detail. But it seems unlikely that they would have been lavish spaces, both because of Ibn Tumart's asceticism and also because they seem to have been small structures built at the behest of the communities that embraced his message. Eventually, Ibn Tumart's small reform movement transformed into legions, which he marshaled against the ruling Almoravids. When Abdul Mu'min, a brilliant general in his own right, captured Marrakesh, one of his first acts was to close and partially destroy the Almoravid Friday Mosque, the same building Ibn Tumart had condemned for containing impure materials. By all accounts, of the movement was close to Ibn Tumart and a faithful Almohad. But he was also a savvy politician, and this is not mutually exclusive, of course. So when the time came to build a symbol of the new regime, a new Friday mosque in a newly conquered capital, he opted for ornamental restraint. This choice serves a dual function. It differentiated Almohad from Almohad architecture, the new dynasty from the old, at the same time that it resonated with the Almohads familiar with Ibn Tumart's asceticism. It is also possible that he modeled it after Ibn Tumart's mosques, although of course this is difficult to prove. So here, in these two instances, all of the ornament, vegetation included, means something by virtue of its symbolic absence. Having said that, both the Tinel and the Kutubiyya mosques do feature an ornamental program that also means something by its presence. In order to see that it does, one has to squint harder, both at leaves and at words. As was the case just a few minutes ago, it's useful to begin with a comparison. On the left is a detail of Almoravid vegetable ornament, a panel taken from the lower part of the dome in Marrakesh's Kubut el-Barabiyin, a structure that perhaps served as an ablution pavilion for the Almoravid Friday Mosque. On the right are two examples of Almohad vegetable ornament, the top from the Tinmel Mosque and the bottom from the Kutubiyya. Overall, the vegetation has become less florid and more abstract. An example of the former quality can be seen in the way that the Almohad vines wind through an ample negative space as opposed to filling the field with leafy abundance, as do the Almoravid example. As for the increased abstraction, the characteristic digits, so it's hard to see, I know, these individual fronds that make up each leaf have been also almost entirely ironed out on the right. Also absent are small islets, pierced holes that typify Almoravid ornament, and of course, the large sculptural palmette in the center of the Almoravid example has disappeared, although it's difficult to say to what extent this motif formed a part of their ornamental repertoire. In contrast, the Almohad leaves are smooth, thick, and pulpy. Their quantity and movement have been reduced, their shapes have been simplified, and their texture, aside from some precise incisions, has been smooth. This newfound abstraction has not gone unnoticed, but scholars have tended to simply explain it as a sort of byproduct of the ornamental restraint that I described a few minutes ago. I think we can go further. In fact, I contend that Almohad ornamental abstraction can help us to understand how the early Almohads defined and communicated their vision of God's nature vis-a-vis the natural world. This is a relationship worth exploring. As many of you know, the Quran itself invites human beings to study the world as a product of divine creation. The first citation on the screen is typical, and it reads, "Truly, in the creation of the heavens and earth, and in the differentiation of night and day, are signs for people of understanding, those who celebrate God's praises sitting, standing, and lying on their sides, and contemplate the creation of the heavens and the earth." But the Quran also cautions humankind against thinking that God is akin to his creation, maintaining an ontological distinction between the creator and created in verses such as Surah Al-Ikhlas. Say, he is God, one, God, the eternal refuge, he does not beget, nor is he begotten, and there is nothing like him. This assertion of God's uniqueness, his dissimilarity to all other things, is mediated by Quranic references to his face or his hands, one of which is the last citation on the screen, all of which imply that God is in fact similar to human beings. So, a relatively straightforward invitation to study the natural world as a product of divine creation coexists with a much more complex question: how much and in what ways is God similar to the things that he made? This question was intensely debated among Muslim scholars and theologians. In 12th century Morocco, it became an issue with real political ramifications. Ibn Tumart himself espoused a highly abstract view of God's transcendent unity. Tawheed is the term in Arabic. He articulated his understanding of Tawheed in an aqidah, or creed, whose abstract philosophical discourse suggests an elite audience. He also composed 2 short murshidas, or spiritual guides, that seem to have been produced for a more general audience. In the interest of time, I will limit my discussion to the second of these guides, which the Almohad caliphs required their subjects to memorize. It begins by commanding that all Muslims know, and this diction will be important, that God is singular in his power. Key characterizations of God include the idea that first, quote, he has no before or after, above or below, left or right, in front or behind, no all or some. Second, that he is not given form with the eye, nor is he pictured in the imagination. And finally, that he is the eternal, not limited by how, the glorious, not limited by singularity. Thoughts cannot define him, nor opinions imagine him. Ideas do not reach him, and reason cannot qualify him. Change and movement are not qualities that he possesses. In these passages, God is utterly unlike his creation, possessing none of the qualities of bodies that occupy a space, such as change or movement. Furthermore, no effort to understand him using human faculties, imagination, thought, opinion, reason, can possibly bear fruit. It is in this sense that the command to know these things about God becomes significant. One cannot really think through them because thought cannot approach God. Apparently, for Ibn Tumart, this essential unknowability is not so troublesome in the context of a short guide for all the Almohad faithful. Instead, his community simply must assent to its truth. In fact, Ibn Tumart seems better able to define what God is by declaring what he is not. His list of binary pairs of things that God doesn't have underscores God's ineffability and dissimilarity by invoking familiar relative and spatial terms. So I can raise my hand, of course, so that it is above my head, in which case my head would be below my hand. They exist in this world as discrete things that are relative to other discrete things, right? But for Ibn Tumart, God is discrete in the absolute sense. He is relative to nothing. These may seem like esoteric concepts, but correct knowledge about them was of the utmost importance to Ibn Tumart. In fact, he incited his early followers to wage war on the Almohads by accusing them of anthropomorphism. Likening God to an existing thing, in this case human beings, became an unforgivable ontological crime. For Ibn Tumart, and at least the first generation of Almohads then, the natural world is not a source for divine truth. And this is true because the truth that they are interested in uncovering is what God is. So the natural world can't help us figure that out. The Quranic call to study the natural world notwithstanding, the only way the world can help an Almohad understand God's nature is by exemplifying everything that he is not. So it is within this highly charged religious and political environment, when accusing someone of being an anthropomorphist could rally an army, that we must consider the restraint and abstraction of vegetal forms in Almohad's mosque. As a reference to the actual leaves in the world beyond the building's walls, merely reducing their quantity is a powerful statement about the suitability of worldly images in sacred space, especially considering that Al-Rafid mosques were bursting with vegetation. Furthermore, the abstracted forms of Almohad leaves, in a way, translate Ibn Tumart's conception of divine transcendence into a language that paradoxically early Almohads could see. I would argue that this process is not unlike communicating what God is by describing what he is not. We cannot picture him in our minds, but here's kind of an image to help us along, right? Recognizing these highly abstracted renderings of leaves, themselves easily recognizable parts of the natural world, then becomes analogous to divesting God of his similarities to creation, to abstracting the very notion of God. If, before their identification as Almohads, an Almohad believer imagined an anthropomorphic God, or even a God that occupied space, they were now called to forcibly abstract this idea, to not only remove the fronds from the leaf, but eventually to erase even its silhouette. So what we know about Ibn Tumart's doctrine, including the spiritual guide I quoted above, is conserved in the so-called Book of Ibn Tumart. This collection of his speech and doctrine seems to have been first written down 30 years after Ibn Tumart died. Therefore, it postdates the Kutubiyya and Tinmal mosques in its written form by 10 to 15 years. We do know that the Almohads employed a body of scholars who memorized Ibn Tumar's doctrine, called the Huffaz, and as his message was being canonized, there were certainly older living Almohads who had known Ibn Tumar and could safeguard his message. Because of this, Alan Frommer suggests that the content of the book of Ibn Tumar would not have changed substantively from the time that he was preaching until the time his words were written. This seems reasonable to me, although just how many of his actual words made it into the text is, of course, impossible to know. This text-image issue, I'm just sort of highlighting it now, is one that we will encounter again with the second generation Almohad Friday Mosque, the Great Mosque of Seville. So those of you who have visited Seville will immediately recognize its emblematic Hirala Tower. Currently, it houses the bells of the city's cathedral, but originally it was the minaret for the Almohad Mosque. A little background: in 1248, Seville, the Almohad's Iberian capital city, fell to King Ferdinand III of Castile, and the mosque was quickly consecrated as the city's cathedral. More gradually, the Castilians made interior modifications to the building that accommodated both the Christian liturgy and the elaborate sepulchres of their kings. Unfortunately for our purposes, what remained of the mosque's prayer hall was gutted and replaced by the extant Gothic interior in the 15th century. So in order to get a sense of what the Mosque of Seville's interior ornament would look like, we must rely on the written record and on archaeology. Most of the Mosque of Seville was built by the second Almohad Caliph, Abu Yaqub Yusuf. His advisor and court historian, Ibn Sahib al-Salat, chronicled the mosque's construction. He describes its interior as follows, quote, "The architects exerted themselves on and took a special interest in the construction of the dome that was raised above the mihrab of the mosque, showing the greatest enthusiasm in the stucco's workmanship, in the vaults of the building, and in the woodworking. All of these labors were treated with extreme care. After drawing attention to the fine craftsmanship of the stucco, domes, and wood, Ibn Sahib al-Salat observes that the mosque's mobilier were worked in equally fine measure. Specifically, he mentions that its wooden minbar and its maksura screen were inlaid with precious materials of ebony and ivory. Taken together, Ibn Sahib al-Salat's descriptions indicate that the mihrab area of the Mosque of Seville was richly ornamented. Excavations performed in the pavilion of offices, which is circled in red at the bottom of the plan on the right, help to confirm Ibn Sahib al-Salat's assertions. In the stratus that corresponds to the period when the mosque was being modified by the Castilians, archaeologists uncovered a small cache of polychrome stucco fragments that they believed to proceed from the mosque's mihrab area. I'm showing you a drawing of just a few of them on the left. These fragments are precious bits of evidence, but they are not without problems. First, although the stucco fragments were found inside independent buildings of the cathedral, they were in fact buried outside what would have been the mosque's original wall. So this is the original qibla wall of the mosque, and the mihrab bay would have been right about here. However, Rosario Bartecamara has observed that the building's 12th and 13th century Christian renovators habitually pierced through this wall. This means that cast-off stucco rubble from the building's interior could easily have gone up extramuros. Second, the excavated area in which the fragments were found quite obviously spans only a fraction of the length of the mosque's wall. Quite simply, this means that further excavations could drastically change our understanding of the amount and kind of stucco originally present in the building. These caveats notwithstanding, this small set of fragments plus Ibn Sahib al-Salat's description are the best evidence currently available in terms of reconstructing the Mosque of Seville's interior program. Looking now at the fragments themselves, I will point out, as does Bartecamara, small sections of architectural forms that suggest a motif known as the sebka. They're most easily seen here, this sort of straight or globed line. Sebka is essentially a lattice pattern, usually generated by arcades, that feature diamond-shaped lozenges. So you see an example of Almohad sebka, which is taken from the Hirala Tower at Seville on the right. Carefully incised vegetal ornament, observable in almost all the recovered stucco pieces, meanders through this architectural framework. Ortega suggests that the recovered material would have formed part of, quote, a large panel of sebca, into which a complex design of vegetal motifs was inserted. Her conclusion is supported by the lozenge's size. Since this line right here would describe sort of upper right-hand corner of a diamond lozenge of sebca, we might double its height, so it's around 4 inches tall, to yield a minimum total height of 1 sebca unit at 8 inches. And you should have seen me with my ruler when I was trying to put this in the talk. So this scale of 8 inches is more appropriate for covering a relatively large surface, such as a wall, than for filling a smaller screen, panel, or ornamental detail. The stucco recovered from the Mosque of Seville, coupled with Ibn Sahab's description, points to 2 shifts in Almohad ornament. First, it seems that the amount of vegetal imagery has increased. So just to return and remind us, using a wider view of the Kutubiyya Mosque, this is the first generation of Almohad buildings, we find Almohad vegetal ornament on the capitals. So here there's some vegetal motifs. On the mihrab facade right here, and in small panels located at the bases of 5 domes in the table transept, which again are not shown in this image. Considered in the broader architectural context of the building, the vegetal forms in the Kutubiyya are either dwarfed by the massive volumes of bare walls, such as these arcades that come to rest rather awkwardly atop very small vegetal capitals, or they're simply difficult to see, like these panels that are located high up the mihrab wall, or those that were tucked away in the base of a dome. In contrast, the Mosque of Seville presents the viewer with a different experience of vegetal imagery. It was meant to be seen. Although I am only in the beginning stages of reconstructing the Mosque of Seville's appearance, this image gives a conservative sense of what its mihrab area and lateral walls might have looked like. I've taken the central mihrab facade itself from a drawing by Bassett and Taras of the Kutubiyya's mihrab. And the reason I've done that is because without a description of what the Mosque of Seville's mihrab looks like, I'm assuming it would have continued former conventions. I've also included 2 relatively small panels of sebca on the lateral walls, and I'm rather looking forward to refining the scale of the lozenges and the shapes of the leaves in future stages of this project. So if the first way that the ornamental program has changed is by increased presence of vegetal forms, the second shift is formal. For now, I simply wish to point out that the Mosque of Seville's stucco vegetation was painted. So rather than looking like this reconstruction, the Mosque of Seville's ornament looked a little bit more like this, colored it rather subtly here. To my knowledge, and all the recovered stucco from the Mosque of Seville has traces of polychrome. This is the only instance of polychrome vegetal stucco in any Almohad mosque. Indeed, with the exception of reused Umayyad marble columns, the earlier generation of Almohad buildings is remarkably monochromatic. The stark white mihrab facade of the Kutubiyya Mosque, which we saw just a moment ago, exemplifies this trend. In the Mosque of Seville, though, a reddish earth tone coupled with black colors the ornaments of sebca. Green is used for the vegetation's vine, leaves, and stems. This color scheme encourages a viewer to read the organic and architectural forms in a more naturalistic way, perhaps recalling arcades covered with jasmine or acanthus that must have graced many a civilian courtyard. Once again, contemporary texts can help explain these changes by giving us some insight into the religious environment in which the Mosque of Seville's polychrome vines took root. In addition to the mosque, the second Almohad Caliph, Abu Yaqub, sponsored prominent intellectuals. The most relevant for our purposes are Ibn Tufayl and Ibn Rushd, the latter of whom is known to the Latin West as Averroes. Both men were Andalusians, and they led active public lives marked by a close relationship to the Almohad Caliph, serving him as advisors and members of an elite group of religious scholars that formed part of his personal entourage. They even shared a medical profession. When Ibn Tufayl resigned as chief physician to the Caliph, Ibn Rushd replaced him. Finally, both men were Aristotelian philosophers and authors. Among other works, sadly lost to us today, Ibn Tufayl wrote a treatise called Hai ibn Yaqdan, which is extant, a fictional biography of a young man named Hai who grew up alone on an island, but was nevertheless able to arrive at certain knowledge that God exists. Ibn Rushd was famously prolific, but we will concentrate on a single text that formed part of a trilogy of short religious works called Exposition of Religious Arguments. Epistemological concerns lie at the heart of both these treatises. Their authors are convinced that humankind can arrive at certain knowledge of religious truth from the observation of the natural world. In Hai ibn Yaqdan, this notion is embodied in the story's protagonist. In one case, Hai systematically studies all of the physical things on his island, finding both wondrous variety and an underlying order that allows him to sort these things into categories: animal, vegetable, mineral, and the like. He also notices that single beings are in fact made up of composite parts: the organs of an animal, the roots, stems, leaves, and flowers of a plant. Expanding the scope of his study, Hai ponders all of the discrete elements contained in both the heavens and the earth, as well as the heavens and earth themselves, in which he finds a similar wondrous variety. But careful thought convinces Hai that all existing things in fact form part of a single, coherent universe. He then deduces that a singular existence must also have a single creator, God. After this epiphany, Hai sees the world in a new light, marveling at the everyday things that he now recognizes as signs of the Creator's wisdom. For his part, Ibn Rushd encourages Muslims to prove God's existence in much the same way that Hai does, by observing creation and exercising reason. In the exposition, for instance, he calls the faithful to notice how perfectly suited the earth is to humankind's existence. Among other examples, Ibn Rushd cites the suitability of night and day, and the sun and the moon, as well as the passing of the seasons, the utility of plants and animals, and even the existence of the four elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Then he declares that the earth's inhabitability cannot be coincidence. Instead, a knowing and willing agent, God, must have designed it purposefully in order to benefit human beings. Essentially, he calls on his reader to look at the world and, like Hai, to see how it all fits together in spite of its complexity. In a second proof, Ibn Rushd states the simple fact there are existing living beings in the world that even humans cannot create. Because all created things require a creator, he continues, it correctly follows that a life and spirit-giving God must also exist. Now, these texts offer the opportunity for a much richer analysis that I have time to give today. But one thing is certain. For both of their authors, courtiers and clients of the Mosque of Seville's patron, the natural world plays a key role in answering the epistemological question of how. How can we arrive at religious truth? Specifically, how can we know that God exists? With this in mind, one way to understand the Mosque of Seville's vegetal ornament is as a visual iteration of this intellectual theological current. The prayer hall's stucco, would have offered the viewer a visible, realistically colored display of leaves climbing up a trellis-like framework. As did the abstracted leaves of the Tinmal and Kutubiyya mosques, this imagery could prompt the recollection of actual vegetation that fills the world. In a Tufailian or Rushdian system, though, and especially in the explicitly religious environment of a mosque, the vegetation might lead a viewer to reflect on God's role as the creator of the observable world. Of course, the Mosque of Seville's vegetal forms do not simply illustrate actual leaves or plants. Their polychromy notwithstanding, the stucco leaves of the Mosque of Seville remained thick, abstracted. The largest stucco fragment reclaimed from the mosque, for example, you can see incisions that sort of divide these forms into composite parts, but in no way do they replace or replicate actual leaves or plants. So I've already suggested that these more abstracted conventions dovetail with Ibn Mark's mistrust of the natural world as a source for understanding divine truth. God is entirely abstract, with no similarities to existing things. So while the stylized leaves in the Mosque of Seville are a far cry from the actual plants that Hai or Ibn Rushd's audience might have contemplated, they do continue a trend begun in earlier Almohad buildings. In doing so, they can hold the same associations with Ibn Tumar's doctrine, while offering additional food for thought for viewers familiar with Ibn Tufail in Ibn Rushd's work. Indeed, Dominique Bourgoy has suggested that Ibn Tufail reconciles Ibn Tumar's abstract, cerebral conception of God with his own empirical outlook. The polychromy and the prominence of the Mosque of Seville's vegetable ornaments can behave analogously. It remains true to Almohad vegetable abstraction, but at the same time, its naturalistic pigment acknowledges the Tufailian or Rushdian formulation of the relationship between the natural and the divine world. So before I conclude, I would like to say a few things about another relationship, and that is the relationship between image and text in the buildings that I have considered. One potential issue that always arises is chronology. With the Mosque of Seville, we simply do not know which was completed first, ornament or text. Ibn Sahib al-Salat notes the building's prayer hall was finished in 1176, but it was not inaugurated until 1182, and then there were repairs to the prayer hall ordered in 1189. All this is to say that we don't know exactly when these leaves took the form that they took. A similar difficulty obtains for our text. We don't know when Ibn Tufail completed Hayy Nahban, although most scholars agree on a date sometime between 1177 and 1182. Ibn Rushd dated his exposition to 1179 or 1180 quite helpfully. However, a newly discovered recension in Istanbul seems to be an earlier draft of the same manuscript. So on the one hand, this situation is different from that of the Book of Ibn Tumart, which contains arguably stable representations of Ibn Tumart's preaching that firmly predate the Tinmal and Qutubiyya mosques. On the other hand, since the Book of Ibn Tumart was written down after they were built, we cannot be sure that its collectors recorded his exact words. In this sense, I think it's much more productive to think of them as codifiers, or if I may, canonizers of Ibn Tumart's doctrine. So this is a problem, right? This is the sort of relationship between text and image, what comes first. But rather than thinking of all of these buildings as a kind of visual gloss on pre-existing or stable texts, or vice versa, we might better describe their relationship according to a mutual reinforcing function. And this is sort of my beginning thoughts. I'm sort of trying to develop this a little bit more fully. So in this framework, according to mutually reinforcing function, right? So in this framework, both verbal and visual texts represent continued efforts from the Almohad elite, caliphs, theologians, memorizers, codifiers of doctrine, philosophers, physicians, and others. All of these people are having this sort of collective effort to define, canonize, and communicate religious knowledge. This communication happened both at an elite and a popular level, both on the page and from the pulpit. Ibn Tufail and Ibn Rushd obviously wrote for a literate elite audience, and Hayy Nahban was indeed widely circulated in Andalusia. So perhaps it ought not to surprise us that the Mosque of Seville departed from early Almohad aesthetics to include more naturalistic representation of leaves. This is different from the state-mandated memorization of Ibn Tumart's Murshida, or popular notions of his asceticism, both of which played a role in the Tinmal and Qutubiyya mosques, and likely discouraged radical departures from Almohad conventions in Seville. The reality is that scholars today only have a few of these efforts, which range from difficult-to-date doctrinal statements to single recensions of manuscripts to tiny fragments of ornament. But this ought not to blind us to the human-driven process of continually defining, redefining, and disseminating ideology. It is, after all, an election year. And now, to sum up. I have suggested tonight that first, the Almohads created systems of meaning that served multiple mutually reinforcing purposes. Second, this activity can, and I would argue does, prompt the creation of unstable and often multivalent products. In the 12th century Maghreb, the Almohads were fundamentally concerned with two things: defining themselves against the Almoravids and expounding their utterly transcendent notion of God. When Ibn Tumar articulated his doctrine in the second spiritual guide, he commanded his followers to simply know that God is unlike anything that exists. He peppered these unequivocal statements with figurative language drawn from the natural world, which underlined that unlike existing things, God is not and cannot be relative. In turn, Abdul-Mu'min's new Almohad aesthetic used abstracted vegetal ornament very sparingly as a visual reminder both that an Almohad cannot trust the natural world as a source for the truth about God's nature, and that, like Ibn Tumar, an Almohad should not be so attached to the natural world in the first place. 30-some years later in Seville, Ibn Tufail and Ibn Rushd were more interested in epistemology, which is perhaps not surprising, given that they were both Aristotelian philosophers and working physicians. Their empiricism resulted in a more urgent emphasis on the natural world as a source for truth, which in turn led to attempts to synthesize this worldview with the traditional Almohad position. Both men used the world as a tool, which when carefully observed and combined with reason, can demonstrate that God exists. As far as we know, they were developing these ideas at the same time that the patron, the Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf, was ordering the Mosque of Seville to be built. Inside, a more traditional Almohad could see the same abstract forms that he had come to expect from Almohad buildings, while a philosopher might see a colorful representation of the natural world spread out before his discerning eye. So after all of this leaf squinting, the precise meanings of Almohad vegetation remains difficult to pin down. But in attempting to figure out what they mean, we have gained a better understanding of the times and the places, the people and the processes that created them. Perhaps this is the true nature of Almohad architectural ornament. Thank you very much.